My name's Reuben and I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I play the trumpet, and today I'm going to talk about setting up a pedal board for live processing. From around 2014 onwards, I increasingly found myself in creative situations where I needed to have a broader sound palette than what I could produce acoustically on the trumpet. At the time, I didn't really have any experience in electronic music making, so I didn't have any experience with laptops or modular synthesis or synthesizers, and so pedals were attracted to me because they seemed a bit simpler to understand, but also they were very tactile, so I felt that I could approach them in a similar way that I do my trumpet. What I want to talk about today are the specific things with my setup that allow me as an acoustic improviser to use something which is normally designed for an electronic instrument. So let me run you through how this setup works. First, we begin with a Biodynamic M88 microphone going into a Eventide Mixing Link, and then from the effects loop gets fed out to the VFE Klein Bottle, which has 3 separate effects loops. So we have effects loop 1, which is the Eventide H9 attached to a old blood noise expression slider. And then number 2 is the Chase Bliss Thermae. Number 3 is the Red Panda Tensor, and those 3 can go in any direction I please. Then from the VFE Klein Bottle, we go straight over to the Cooper Effects Generation Loss. This is the Chase Bliss version. Then it goes into a JBL Nano Patch Volume Controller, and then from there we go into a Chase Bliss Blooper. Then out from there into a King of Gear Mini Glitch pedal, and then over to an Eventide with another old blood noise expression slider. And instead of going back into the effects loop of the Eventide, I've got that running stereo out. And then also from the Eventide Mixing Link, I have a dry signal of the trumpet or the object going out through its line out DI signal as well. That's all being powered by a Zoomer power supply by Strymon. It's worth pointing out that I will often change the chain of effects depending on the needs of the concert. So quite often this whole configuration will completely change from gig to gig. One constant is that I always have this preamp with me because it offers quite a lot of different possibilities. Most importantly, if I have the ability to send stereo effects, I can send that separately by not sending the effects back into the effects loop and just having it going stereo out on the final part of the chain. But I can also send the dry signal directly separate from the effects with this device. There's a lot of really fantastic resources online that go into the really minute detail about how some of these pedals work and what you can do with them. First and foremost, I need to send a signal to the pedals, so I use a microphone. If I'm using objects as well as a trumpet, I like to use a microphone on a stand. That means that I can play with the proximity of the sound source towards the microphone and really get some different spatial elements involved. If I'm just using a trumpet, I do like to use a clip-on microphone, and that allows me to keep a consistent distance away from the microphone and keep a really sort of constant signal source going through. One thing that's really important to remember if you're not a guitarist or a keyboard player or a synthesizer player is that you need to find a way to increase the gain of the mic signal before it reaches the pedal. Otherwise, you are working with an extremely low signal compared to what the pedal's used to, and you don't really get the most out of them. So you need a preamp. This has to be my favorite pedal of all time, simply because it solved so many problems that I didn't realize I was having. So it's a preamp that has an inbuilt effects loop in it, which means that I can send a signal to my pedals whenever I want to. It's got 2 ways of doing that. It's got a latch mode, where it stays on, and it's got a hold mode, which is really great if you're dubbing in effects into your system. It's got a really nifty input gain knob, so you can boost the signal of your microphone for whatever it needs. Some microphones need more signal than others. It's also got an extra gain booster down here, which is pretty intense but useful sometimes. It's got 3 ways of mixing the effect signal. You've got the effects only, which means that when this is turned on, you get nothing but the wet effects, which is sending out here. You've got a mix version, which means you can dial in the amount of wet signal, so affected signal, that you want. And then it's also got a dry plus effects signal, which means that you get a unity gain signal as well as a wet signal, regardless of how you turn this knob. So that goes through an effects loop, throughout your pedals, and then back into the effects loop here. Or in my case, what I like to do is I like to send the effects out here, have this on dry plus effects setting, and then send a stereo signal of my pedals out, which means I get a completely dry, unaffected signal from my microphone, and I also get a completely wet stereo signal coming from my pedals. A few other nifty things about this: it's got a DI built into it, but that can be shifted from a DI level to a line level, which is really useful when you're doing studio recording, because sometimes you need to have the signal at the same level for recording purposes, but if you're in a live context, you don't want it to be that hot. Sometimes you want it to be at a DI level, which is lower. You've got a ground lift, which is really fantastic when you find that mysterious buzzing noise in your setup. Sometimes that switch just fixes all those problems. It's also got a phantom power switch, which is super handy because a lot of great microphones require phantom power. You can also run it on batteries, which is pretty cool. And also a few nifty things, it's got a phone and amp level. So what I like to do sometimes if I'm playing in a small room, instead of sending an XLR signal to the front of house or to a powered speaker, I like to send a instrument line out from my effects level and ride the volume over here. So I play with a powered speaker quite often, and that means that I can really adjust my levels depending on what is happening in the room. Great for when you're balancing acoustic music with electronic music. One of the major creative limitations of using pedals is that you have a fixed effects chain, which means that depending on how you set up your board, the signal path will only go a certain way, and it's very hard to change that mid-performance or between gigs. This thing solves a bit of that problem, and this is why this is one of the most important parts of my setup, even though it makes no sound. This allows me to have 3 separate effects chains running from one signal. So my mic goes into the VFE Klein Bottle, and then I can send that signal to 3 separate places in total isolation. And then I can route that into different areas. So I can send signal 1 over to signal 3 and then signal 2 if I want to, or I can send signal 2 into 2 other places. A few other things about this that make it so great is that it also has inbuilt pre and post gain knobs, which means that I can boost the signal for one pedal but keep it reduced for the other depending on what the pedal needs. I can also do a high pass and low pass roll off for each signal, which is really useful depending on the kind of effects you're using. It's also got a phase knob, which is kind of useful, especially for very subtle things to solve some problems. And it's also got a dry signal mix as well. So if I want to send a dry signal through to my pedals, I can, as well as an overall master knob. So it's kind of taking the place of a very, very, very nifty mixer, but a fraction of the size. Another thing that I find really useful is to have multiple places where I can adjust the gain structure of what's going on. So having things like this, which is essentially a volume pedal, in the middle of my setup or at different points along the chain, allows me to really minutely adjust how signal's going. Because once again, if you're not using a enclosed sound source like a guitar or a synthesizer, then you've got a lot more volatility, and some of these pedals require certain amounts of gain to work, and if you go too hard it will overload it, it'll distort, or it'll fall apart in a way that isn't very interesting. So I find I have quite a few spaces along my pedal chain where I will adjust the volume as it goes through. And also, once again, going back to isolation, it's really helpful because it means that if I have a delay or some kind of reverb or some kind of noise source that is oscillating that I want to play with or play around with, if I can isolate the signal before or after it, it means I have more control. Speaking of control, a simple but really effective thing that I've found is to have expression pedals. So expression pedals essentially allow you to control specific parameters on a pedal. For a digital pedal, where you have ways of really clocking in certain parameters, it's very useful because you don't have to dive into certain menus all the time. And even for more analog things such as this, being able to set the things that you want to adjust and then just move one or two sliders or push one pedal allows you to have more freedom of movement. So those things are really important for me. If I was going to recommend one effects pedal for anyone who is using a microphone to source their sound, I would recommend the Eventide H9. It's a digital effects pedal that gives you access to the entire range of Eventide's effects. It comes with an application that allows you to remotely access all of the effects parameters and also map it to an expression pedal. Now that aspect is the reason why this is so good. If you're using a microphone and you're using things like reverb or distortion or delay, it means that you have a lot of possibilities for feedback, which is unpleasant, depending on the kind of feedback you want. But even good feedback you have to be able to control. And when you're using a microphone, that becomes really, really difficult, especially in live context. So being able to set the 100% mark and the 0% mark on any effect means that you can dial in exactly how far you want to push certain parameters before they blow back in your face. And this has given me so much more flexibility and finite detail on how I want to push my sounds in certain ways. So it's a great investment if anyone wants to explore this area and doesn't know where to start. As someone who comes from a background of acoustic music making, the way I relate my practice to using pedals is I have always used acoustic music as my primary source of influence and guidance. So whenever I approach a new pedal or if I approach a new sound that I can make from these things, it's a means of expanding or morphing something that is already there. And I would recommend for anyone who is interested in exploring these areas to ground yourself in your acoustic practice and use that as your guiding light, because there's a lot of things that are different when you go into electronic music making, but there are a few key things that are similar, and if you are grounded in what you know from the acoustic realm, then that'll help you get through all those spaces. I hope that's helpful.